We're live. Are we live? Yeah?
I guess.
All right. All right. I hope my mic's on. It's been one of those kind of mornings, and maybe it's
my
been
mic
one of
was
those
on. There
kind
we
of
go.
mornings for you guys, too. We're kind of... Welcome to Midweek Live. We're glad you're here. Thanks for hanging out with us today. Welcome to something that we do periodically during different seasons in the calendar of our church, or the life of our church, where just kind of as an additive, like a bonus thing that we do that allows people like you to jump in the middle of the week when you're a few days from Sunday and maybe your week has been good, maybe it's been not so good, and you just need a little bit of something to kind of refresh your spirit and encourage your soul. And that's what we hope happens here, because I think anytime that we dive into the Word of God, that's what it has the power and potential to do. And if you're like me, fighting a little bit of a cold and just navigating some things this week, you sit down here and you take a deep breath. And so whether you're watching this live or whether you're watching it on demand at some point, we hope that what you're about to hear from us encourages your spirit and does something to kind of give you that spiritual boost that you need here in the middle of a new week.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, we love to know if you're watching right now live, if you're on Facebook or YouTube, hop in the chat, say hello, and we'd love to say hi to you, and just let us know what you're learning, whether that's you put it in the comments, or you can always use that Vintage Church app, the respond feature, to let us know that you watched Midweek Live. Tell us what you're learning. Tell us what you see that maybe we didn't cover or we've missed, because you know that there's a word for it, and I don't know what it is off the top of my head, like where you're shopping for a certain kind of car, and then the only kind of car that you see.
I don't shop for cars.
No, Matt doesn't. He just goes to the lot and just buys one. There's no shopping.
That's a whole nother story.
Okay.
Anyway.
So, but you know what I'm talking about? Where then you start to see that thing
Yes.
all the time.
I don't know what that phenomenon is called, but yes. I've experienced it.
Yeah.
It's like you are looking for a Tacoma.
Yeah.
And next thing you know, you see Tacomas everywhere you go.
And it's not that...
There's got to be a name for that.
There is. There's actually a name for it. You can Google it real quick if you want to. Yeah. But the thing that we're hoping...
Maybe somebody knows. They can put it in the chat.
Yeah, if you know, pop it in the chat here. The thing that we're hoping to do here is to start maybe pointing out where in the Old Testament we see Jesus, where Jesus is clearly present, where Jesus is not, flesh as, wrapped in human flesh, but as the Son of God, as the Word of the Trinity, where he appears in Scripture even before he was born into, human flesh that we read about in the New Testament. And so we hope that by pointing these out, that you start to see it, like that you can't escape it as you're reading through the Old Testament, just in your free time.
Yeah, we're doing this in this season of Lent, and we're getting super close to Easter.
Oh my gosh.
Which is mind-boggling to me. We're just a few days away from April, but we thought a cool way to walk us up to Easter, and again, we do this during Lent. We try to be very intentional as a church so that we don't just run into Easter in a way that is super casual.
Nope.
Or even more kind of cultural and get caught up in, and there's nothing wrong. I hope you're doing Easter baskets for your kids and all that kind of stuff. But to make sure that we're intentionally preparing our hearts and minds to come in on that Easter Sunday celebrating Jesus. And one of the things that we've noticed as we've moved into this year, and we've done this release in the Word, trying to increase people's excitement and time in the Word, that we want people to see the beauty and power and have appreciation for what happens in the Old Testament, because as you said, and I don't know that it was unique to you.
No, it's not.
That this is one unified story.
Yes.
And we were kind of walking Genesis to Jesus. And now we're not going to go all the way from Genesis to Jesus.
We just can't.
Because we have a couple episodes left in this season
Yep.
before we're finished for a while, and we're not going to get there. But last week, we kind of transitioned in to one of the books that most people really kind of get lost in or avoid or start, and you're doing a reading plan, then you get to this book, Leviticus, and it seems so complicated or there's so much detail that you start to drown in the detail. And as we pointed out last week, that in Leviticus, it's revealing this system that God was setting up in order to put humanity in a position where he could commune with them.
Yes.
Because that is God's heart. That's what we see in the garden. That sin ruined, it separated us from him. It disrupted the communion he wanted to have with us. And because of our sinfulness, we can't be in his presence.
Right.
And so all of the scriptures is about putting humanity back in the position that we need to be in order to be washed and made clean so that we could experience the holy presence of God. And Leviticus is setting up this system that will be ultimately fulfilled in Jesus, but through these sacrifices and offerings. And last week we talked about these 5 offerings.
Right.
But there's something very unique in this that we wanted to lean into a little bit in more detail today. And so hopefully, if you watched last week, and if you didn't watch last week, go back and watch last week.
Yeah.
Because I think even all the things that we're going to talk about today make more sense if you hear kind of like the precursor to what we're going to talk about today in last week's episode.
Yeah. I mean, don't peace out on us. Still, hang out. But you'll definitely want to go back and watch last week's if you missed it, because it definitely gives a greater context to what we're going to cover today. So like Matt said, in Leviticus, God is able to set up this system that allows his people to be clean and holy so that he can commune with them. And on kind of a regular basis, there is, ongoing sin offerings and burnt offerings that sort of, I don't want to say appease God, but keep the people purified.
Right.
So that God can continue to meet with them.
That's a good distinction. It's much more about purifying us than appeasing God.
Yeah. And that was really a distinction between the other surrounding cultures at that time. That's why, because sacrifices were not unique to God's people, to Israel.
Oh, yeah.
It was, this was
a common practice in polytheistic, which is like people who believe in multiple gods.
Yeah.
Sacrifices and that kind of thing were definitely a commonplace.
But you did it to appease the gods.
Right.
You brought them in to say hey,
they're mad, let's make them happy.
They're mad, let's make them happy. And this is not the system that God set up. It's the system by which we are made clean so that God can be with us.
Right.
So
that's a good distinction. That's cool that I think that's an important, because, and I don't want to chase the rabbit trail too much, is one of the things that I constantly hear is, Christianity and the God of the Bible is like every other religion. And it is 100% not. There is so much, again, this is about God wanting to commune with us, not about God forcing us to jump through hoops to get with him.
Right.
And to me, that is the number one distinctive thing about Christianity and versus religion of the world.
Yeah.
Is it's all about, other religions are about how we get to God, and all of Scripture is about what God has been doing from the beginning of time to get to us.
Yep, absolutely. So I want to set up a little bit of context for us before we get into this Day of Atonement that God sets up as an annual day of sacrifice and covering and atonement for his people. So on Mount Sinai, when God gives Moses the 10 Commandments, part of what he also gives is this outline of how to build a physical space where God would come and dwell with his people, where his presence would be. So it's called the tabernacle. This is basically it's a portable church sort of thing, where it is.
We know a lot about portable church.
We know a lot about portable church. So they could carry this from place to place. There was this a tent, and then there were things that went inside of the tent that would help them to be able to do these sacrifices and things. So we do have an image for you. So Storm, if you want to show this, this is the tabernacle. This is the layout of the tabernacle. And you'll see that there's that black line all the way around the outside. This was the exterior walls of the tent. It would have been open air. So if you went through that entrance gate, you would see, you could look up and, see the sky and everything. And the first thing that you encounter is the altar of burnt offerings. And so any kind of burnt offering was made to the Lord there. And a burnt offering is exactly what it sounds like. Portions of meat weren't taken necessarily off of this. The things were put on and then set on fire, and just the smoke is what God wanted. He said, he's not going to come down and eat this stuff. Because God doesn't need to eat. But the offering itself is like a fragrant offering to him. Then you have this bronze laver, sure. That was just a basin that the priests would use to clean themselves before they would move into the holy place. You'll see an altar of incense there. There was a lampstand that kind of looked like a tree almost. And then a table of showbread, which is where they would put grain offerings and things. And they would bring bread made with salt. That would be there. And then you had this most holy place. It was separated by a curtain. And the holy place and most holy place were not open air. It was tented in. And then inside of the most holy place was the Ark of the Covenant, which was, if you've seen Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark, you know exactly what the Ark of the Covenant looks like, which was basically just a big box covered in gold, and inside was kept the stones that the commandments were written on, a jar of manna, something else.
Yeah.
Something else. I should know that. But that was what was kept inside of the Ark of the Covenant. And then on top of the Ark of the Covenant was something called the mercy seat. And we'll show you a picture of that in just a second. But the mercy seat is where his presence would dwell while he was meeting with the priest. So, all right. So let's dive into Leviticus 16, unless there's anything you want to add about the tabernacle.
No, I just think it's just that picture's super cool to because you hear us talk about these things from time to time, and then you've kind of heard us talk about the temple, and which will be something that's erected later, but a lot of these same elements are represented in a more permanent, elaborately built structure that contain these things. But it's cool to visually see, and each one. There were layers to this thing, and all those layers have meaning. Yeah,
and more meaning than honestly we can even get into today. But certainly something of interest if that's something that you want to dig into. All right, so let's look at Leviticus 16. This whole chapter lays out the precedent for the Day of Atonement. So starting in verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses after the death of two of Aaron's sons when they approached the presence of the Lord and died. The Lord said to Moses, "Tell your brother Aaron that he may not come whenever he wants into the holy place behind the curtain in front of the mercy seat on the ark, or else he will die, because I appear in the cloud above the mercy seat." So right off the bat, there's a couple things you need to know. Aaron had 4 sons. They were all ordained as priests to attend to the Lord and sort of be that intermediary between God's people and God himself. Aaron was the great high priest, and then his 4 sons were sort of just next tier priests, and they helped do the business of the tabernacle. Well, 2 of those sons, I think Nahab and Abihu, great names.
Bless you.
They went into the presence of the Lord. They offered an unauthorized fire. And there's several, we're not exactly sure what that means, have some ideas. But anyway, because they did something that God had not set out for them to do, they died. God sent down fire and killed them. There was a level of arrogance there
Yeah.
that they could just do things as they wanted, and they died. And so he wants Aaron to know, you cannot just come in here all willy-nilly and be in my presence. And so over the next few verses, he's going to lay out when you can actually come. So I want you to see this image of the Ark of the Covenant.
Well,
Okay, go
real
ahead.
quick.
Sorry.
Like, that's one of those moments that people start freaking out. Like,
Oh, okay.
when you see, like, okay, God strikes people dead in something that in maybe our human mind seems to be
Not a big deal.
an extreme penalty for something in our minds that seems quite insignificant.
Right.
And that's where people get really freaked out about the Old Testament. You know, like there's a time when these kids are picking on Elijah and a bear comes out and eats them up. And they're like, that freaks you out. You know, there's number one, it's because some of our theology is so watered down with our human experience.
Yeah.
And understanding too in these moments that God is a God who means what he says, and is a God who follows through on what he says.
Yes.
And that's one of the things, you know, I have these conversations with people. Why would God, you don't want to be that parent that always says something
That there's a
but
consequence.
then doesn't follow through. None of us respect that person that says,
Correct.
I'm going to do this if you do this. I'm going to do this if you do this. And then somebody does that thing and we don't follow our word.
Yeah.
That's not the God that we serve. That God is a God who, when he says something, he can't not do it. It's in his character and nature. And so I think that's just something really important, because even in this whole Day of Atonement, that's why these things are so important. That there's a reason why God has given these instructions, and we can't get angry with God when he tells us something and then when he follows through with what he said.
Right. Well, and you
You
know,
know?
his.
Am I making sense? I hope I'm making
no,
sense.
you're absolutely making sense. You also have to understand that these two men were not just any rando Joe Israelite off the street. They had been set apart. They had been ordained as people who were going to represent God to the people and represent the people to God. So there was definitely a heightened level of accountability, of expectation, of understanding of what God has laid out. It's not like they had not been instructed. It's not like they didn't know that what they were going to do was not what they were supposed to do. Like, they knew and they did it anyway. They did something that was unauthorized by God. They showed a level of an unwillingness to submit to God.
Yeah.
And as the person who is supposed to bring these sacrifices on behalf of the people, like that cannot stand.
Right.
So,
yeah.
So anyway.
Because I think, again, that's the kind of stuff we read in the Old Testament, and people get really
yeah.
It doesn't seem to compute with some of our theology, but some of our theology is a little off.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So, in this most holy place, there was something called the Ark of the Covenant. And on top of the Ark of the Covenant is this mercy seat. And so Storm's going to show us now this mercy seat. It's two angels, two cherubim, right? That have their wings covered. And the mercy seat is right in the center of those angels who are covering. And it says, because I appear in the cloud above the mercy seat. And so this mercy seat is the most holy of the holy spots in the most holy place. And and it was sort of central inside of this tent. And so he cannot just walk in there whenever he wants. So Aaron is the high priest, and God lays out these things in sort of the first 12 verses. He tells Aaron, on this day, you need to gather these 5 different animals, 2 of them, a bull and a ram. These are going to be offerings for him, because Aaron himself is also unclean. Like, even though he's the priest, it doesn't mean that he is without sin. And if he enters into the most holy place while being unclean, he will die just as his sons did. So the first thing that he does is he takes off his garments, he washes his body, he puts on these clean linen garments, and then he has a bull that is for his sin. It's an offering for his sin, and a ram that's the burnt offering that the fragrance is pleasing to God. He also is required to get from the Israelite community 2 goats and a ram. The 2 goats are Israel's sin offering, and the ram is Israel's burnt offering. And so then those first 12 verses lay out, these are the offerings these are the animals you need to bring in, and this is what they are for. And we're going to pick up here in verse 12. All right, verse 12 says, "Then he is to take a fire pan full of blazing coals from the altar before the Lord, and 2 handfuls of finely ground fragrant incense, and bring them inside the curtain." So he would have gotten a fire pan from that very first altar where the burnt offering is, gotten coals from that, and then he's going to bring them inside the curtain. He is to put the incense on the fire before the Lord so that the cloud of incense covers the mercy seat that is over the testimony or Ark of the Covenant, or else he will die. He is to take some of the bull's blood and sprinkle it with his finger against the east side of the mercy seat. Then he will sprinkle some of the blood with his finger before the mercy seat 7 times. Now the bull's blood, remember, that is for his personal sin offering. When he slaughters the male goat for the people's sin offering and brings its blood inside the curtain, he will do the same thing with its blood as he did with the bull's blood. He is to sprinkle it against the mercy seat and in front of it. He will make atonement for the most holy place in this way, for all their sins because of the Israelites' impurities and rebellious acts. He will do the same for the tent of meeting that remains among them because it is surrounded by their impurities. So there's this image of, he's got this bull that he has sacrificed for his sin that came from him. It came from among the Levites.
Right.
And then the goat, which came from among Israel, among the community of Israel. Both of those things are sacrificed, and the blood is sprinkled on the mercy seat, wiped on the mercy seat, in order to make atonement, both for the sins of him, the people, and for the most holy place. That in all of it, it is covering, it is making clean, it is putting everything back in right order and right standing with God. So that's how the sacrifice piece has played out. Now, you'll remember that there's 2 goats.
Yes.
All right, 1 goat is sacrificed.
Right.
For the sin offering. There's this other goat.
Yeah.
So interesting. So here's what they do. They bring the 2 live goats to the entrance of the tent of meeting, so kind of like outside of the tent.
Right.
They cast lots, or he casts lots and decides 1 goat is going to live and 1 goat is going to die as the sin offering. But the one that lives is now going to be the scapegoat.
Right.
Okay, this is where the term scapegoat comes from. All right, so let's look at verse 20. It says, "When he has finished making atonement for the most holy place, the tent of meeting, and the altar, he is to present the live male goat. Aaron will lay both his hands on the head of the live goat and confess over it all the Israelites' iniquities and rebellious acts, all their sins." So there's that image again that we talked about last week of laying your hands on the thing that is going to carry the weight, the sacrifice, whatever that needs to happen for your sin. That carries the weight of your sin. He is to put them on the goat's head and send it away into the wilderness by the man appointed for the task. The goat will carry all their iniquities into a desolate land, and the man will release it there. Then Aaron is to enter the tent of meeting, take off the linen garments he wore when he entered the most holy place, and leave them there. Now, there's a lot there.
Yes.
For us to unpack and help point our eyes
Bring it back to Jesus. Yeah.
All right. So let's start with those goats.
Yeah.
I thought in the beginning, well, I guess maybe in some ways both of the goats are representative.
For sure.
Representative of Jesus.
For sure.
But that scapegoat, there's several things very interesting there.
Yeah.
That he himself for our sins.
Right.
That in Aaron confessing the sins, the weight of sin is on that goat.
Yeah.
And our sin is the same way on Jesus.
And you even think about that, the hands would not just be put on the goat, they would be placed on the goat's head. And that would happen inside the city, inside this area. And you think about when Jesus, there was a crown of thorns fashioned and it was placed on his head.
Yep.
And even thorns are very much represented, a representation of sin, of struggle, of pain, of the hurt that was brought in by sin at creation. And so just as Aaron would lay his hands on the head of the scapegoat, hands were laid on the head of Jesus and a crown of thorns, like that sinful. I think we think about the crown, we think about him as king, we think about that representation of the crown, but you also think about the sins of humanity pressed on the head of Jesus. And just like the goat would then be sent out into the wilderness, into a desolate place, and really both goats would die.
Oh, yeah.
One would die in the city, sacrificed by the hand of the high priest. The other one would be sent out and eventually die probably as well, because it was sent out of the city and all that kind of stuff. And Jesus, his hands, or the hands and the thorns are placed on his head, but then he's led out of the city to Golgotha, where he would be crucified. And you see that, of all the things, kind of stands out to me as that thing that I can't move away from. And then you think about like just the whole scapegoat language. I don't even think most people knew that terminology is rooted in Leviticus and the Day of Atonement, and because we've used that word scapegoat in our common language for years.
Absolutely. And I also think about these animals that were brought were unblemished animals.
Right.
So they would have been the most beautiful and perfect specimens of, goat, bull, ram, whatever, to carry that sin. And so there is this image. And I think that's sometimes why we have a hard time reading about animal sacrifice, where it's like that animal did nothing wrong.
Right.
And we have such angst and anger at the idea of somebody sacrificing an animal to make up for something that a sinful human did. And that's the point.
That's the point.
Where we have...
It should grieve your heart.
It should absolutely grieve your heart. Yeah. And that's, one of those things where when we look, from here toward Easter, and we look toward that cross of Jesus, there should be that weight. There should be that grief of, you shouldn't have died for me.
Right.
Because you didn't do the things that I have done.
Right.
But that is what qualified Jesus to be our sacrificial lamb, you know?
Yeah. And it's why it's really important that we understand and believe in the sinless life of Jesus.
Yes.
That if Jesus had sinned, he died for his own sin and could not die for ours. Yeah. And so that is a really important part of our theology.
Absolutely.
And that's a word that you're hearing us use a lot more around our church, like theology and doctrine, because they're really big terms that don't make sense sometimes, but these things are really, really important. And when you read that last part, and I don't know if you were going here next, that Aaron, then Aaron is to enter the tent of meeting, take off the linen garments he wore when he entered the most holy place, and leave them there. And you think about the things that were left in the empty tomb on the other side of the cross, on the other side of the resurrection, when all this was finished. Right. Because that would be the last thing that Aaron would do.
Yes.
When it was all finished and all the sacrifices had been made and everything that needed to be done was done for the atonement of the sins of his people, he would take off those clothes, leave them in that place, and walk out.
Yeah.
And when Mary finds the empty tomb, the grave clothes of Jesus are in the empty tomb.
Yes.
And again, it's that symbolic thing of everything that needed to be done has been done by the great high priest, Jesus.
Yeah. So, oh gosh, there's so many things. But let's go on to 29, and then we'll sort of wrap up. So verse 29 says, "This is to be a permanent statute for you. In the 7th month, on the 10th day of the month, you are to practice self-denial and do no work, both the native and the alien who resides among you. Atonement will be made for you on this day to cleanse you, and you will be clean from all your sins before the Lord. It is a Sabbath of complete rest for you, and you must practice self-denial. It is a permanent statute. So a few things here. On this day, it's a Sabbath, you do no work, and self-denial is fasting from food. You're to deny yourself any kind of pleasure or good thing, basically. Not as a way of punishment, but as a way of saying, it says it in verse 30, atonement will be made for you. There was nothing that they could do that would make them right. There was nothing that they could do to contribute to the atonement outside of just the giving of those 2 goats and the ram. That was it. But even then, all they were doing was giving 3 animals for like 1 million people. There was nothing that they could do. There was nothing they could do to earn it or to make themselves feel better about this thing that was happening on their behalf. They only could sit and accept it. That was it. And, I think that's an important reason that we fast during this season of Lent, that we fast in general, that we do practice Sabbath, that we have a time that is set aside to say, I'm not going to work, but I'm going to take in the fact that God has done all this work for me. And that while I'm not working, he holds it all together in, the way that God does. And that it was a practice, that it's a permanent statute. When I think about what Jesus said on the cross, and he said, it is finished, that a lot of times we think that what he was saying on the cross was, my life is finished. I'm finished breathing here on this earth, but he wasn't. He was declaring the thing that had been set as a permanent statute is finished. Because at that moment, the veil, I'm going to cry, the veil in the temple was torn in two from top to bottom that separated the outer courts from the most holy place. It separated. It was finished. That system that had to be in place in order to make us clean and holy was finished. It was done.
Complete.
And we saw that, or Peter and John saw that in seeing those linen garments folded up in the empty tomb as a symbol of saying the work has been done. Yeah. It is finished.
That's good.
So I want us to look at Romans 6:10. It's kind of skipping over a little bit here, but it says, for the death he died to sin once for all time. But the life he lives to God. That the thing that they were supposed to do every year, Jesus has done once for all time, which I think is an interesting thing. It's not once from henceforth. It's once for all time, beginning to end. So there is something that goat could not have done.
Right.
That even in retrospect, because God is not bound by the timeline that we are on in our humanity, that Jesus redeemed everything from beginning to end in that moment. For all of time.
Not from like that point forward, but from, it's good.
Well, and you can even see,
great distinction.
Sorry, Storm, we're going to go back to Romans 3, verse 25. It says, God presented him, this is Jesus, and this I'm reading from the CSB here. God presented him, Jesus, as the mercy seat by his blood through faith to demonstrate his righteousness, because in his restraint, God passed over the sins previously committed. So you see, a lot of your translations might say presented him as the propitiation, as the atoning sacrifice. But that word there is hyla or hilasterion, which is the word for mercy seat. And that language is so intentionally used by Paul there that he's saying Jesus himself was the mercy seat where God's presence dwelled and where blood was spilt in order that he might make us righteous, pass over sins previously committed. And he goes on in verse 26. He says, God presented him to demonstrate his righteousness at the present time, so that he would be just and justify the one who has faith in Jesus. As we've been reading through the Old Testament in this Bible recap we've been doing, something that Tara Lee Cobble has said over and over is that God provides what he requires. What God requires, he also provides.
Sure.
And we see that here, that God requires us to be clean and holy, but he also makes the way for us to be clean and holy. It is nothing that we have done. We are like those Israelites sitting outside of the tent of meeting on the Day of Atonement, resting and practicing self-denial, knowing that there is nothing that I can do that's going to make me right, because Jesus has done it all.
Yeah, which means we really have nothing to complain about. That, you can look at this and be like, man, God required so much, but he gave so much.
He gave all that was needed.
I think about that as you're reading Romans, and you think about Paul. What we're doing in this series is exactly what Paul would do to convert people to belief in Jesus.
Yeah.
Is he would open up these scriptures that even if you didn't grow up Jewish, you had known about, you had heard about, and he would say, see all these things?
Yeah.
And all the stuff that was written about Jesus, I've known this stuff my whole life, and for the first time, I see it.
Yes.
I see Jesus in it. I see the connection in it. And so when he writes things like Romans, he's connecting that old Jewish part of him and seeing it now through this new lens and connecting the dots that from beginning to end, God had been making himself known and making his plan of redemption for humanity known in everything that is woven throughout the Old Testament.
Yeah.
It's so good.
Absolutely. We'll end with 1 John 2, 1 and 2. John writes, my little children, I'm writing you these things so that you may not sin. But if anyone does sin, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ, the righteous one. He himself is the atoning sacrifice for our sins, and not only for ours, but also for those of the whole world. That he is at the right hand of the Father. He is that intermediary, that mediator between us and the Lord. He is interceding for us, and he is also the sacrifice. He is that atoning sacrifice that is saying, I've covered them, and they can come to you, and not just for us, but for that of the whole world.
Yeah. And go read Hebrews.
Oh yeah.
Where we talks about the high priest that is Christ, and you see even more of that connection, like Hebrews 4, Hebrews 10.
Yep.
You see that language woven all throughout that as well.
Yep.
It's
Absolutely.
good stuff.
All right. Well, next week we're gonna finish up the Torah. So we'll hit some things in Numbers and Deuteronomy. We're going to try to do 2 books. We didn't even get to do Leviticus. It took 2 weeks to do just one book. But that's where we'll be next week. And please let us know that you're watching. Please let us know what you're learning. We love that.
Hello to everyone on Facebook. There's a handful of folks there. Thanks for hanging out with us today.
For sure.
Sorry that I'm sniffling in this microphone every 30 seconds.
'Tis the season.
Yeah.
All right, y'all. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time.
Alrighty.